Good afternoon and welcome to T.C. Williams High School. I'm Mark Eaton and we're here in the television studio at T.C. Williams for an unscripted press conference. T.C. Williams journalism students will be having an informal conversation with Margaret Sullivan. Ms. Sullivan is the media columnist for the Washington Post. A native of Western New York, she began her career on the Buffalo News and rose to the positions of editor and managing editor. In 2012, Ms. Sullivan was appointed the public editor of the New York Times. She served in that capacity for 4 years. She's been in Washington on the Washington Post for nearly a year, and we expect a fascinating conversation today about journalism in this very interesting political era, the impact of social media, the future of journalism, and all kinds of other things. So please stay with us and enjoy this conversation. It's unscripted, and our journalism students are very interested in what Ms. Sullivan has to say. So without further discussion, Ms. Sullivan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Eaton, and hi, everyone. Looking forward to hearing your questions, and I'll do my best to answer them as well as I can. So would anyone like to get started? Yes. It would be great if you would, I don't know if you would normally, but tell me your name and what year you were in. That would be great.
Okay. I'm Nicholas Gentry. I'm a sophomore at T.C. Williams. In your article, Trump's message of mistrust sinks in even in this golden age of journalism. You said that as we enter year 2 of the Trump presidency, it's time to build upon successes and bear down hard on remedying the failures. How do you feel the media has accomplished or not accomplished that in the second year of Trump's presidency?
So thank you. We're pretty early in the second year, only a couple of months into it, but I would say that we're in a really interesting and kind of weird phase for journalism in that there's a lot of great journalism being done, but we have been, I think, very distracted by all the very fast pace of news and all the strange events that have been happening. So it's very hard to keep focused on the most important things that would affect people, you know, in the most important ways, and it's very easy to get distracted. But I think there's a lot of great investigative journalism going on and a lot of important accountability journalism too. So it's a little bit of both, but I would say in general it's been pretty positive.
Thank you.
Thank you. Someone else?
Move this up a little bit. Hi there, I'm
Hi.
Colin Kennedy, and I'm a freshman here at TC. And calling back to your time at the New York Times, you were the public editor there, and so obviously they've eliminated that position both at the Times and then the equivalent at the Post. And so you do work as the media columnist, and they're not quite the same job, obviously, but you do certainly still seem to write a lot about kind of journalism and the news media as it is. And I just want to know, did your time as the public editor really inform how you write about the media?
Okay. So thank you. And thanks for knowing so much about what happened with the public editor's job. So as you guys, I guess, seem to know, the public editor is kind of like an internal watchdog at a newspaper, and the Times has eliminated it, and the Post had an ombudsman or ombudswoman, and they got rid of their similar job a few years ago. So my job right now is pretty different because I'm not an internal watchdog in any way. I really write about the broader world of media. But yes, it's been definitely, I've been helped a lot by having done that, but I also feel like every job I've had in my life has kind of built on the last one. So what I'm doing now also takes advantage of the fact that I was the top editor at a pretty big newspaper with 200 newsroom employees. So I was able to bring that to the public editor job and now bring what I learned in both places to what I'm doing now. And I also find that I have to explain to people all the time that I'm not the ombudsman of the Washington Post, because a lot of readers wish that the Post did have someone that they could complain to when they see a problem, and so they think, well, there isn't one, so I think I'll complain to her because she used to do this. And I'm constantly having to say, well, that's really not my job anymore, but I try to at least send them to somebody who might be able to help them.
Just quick follow-up. So, with the elimination of the ombudsman position and the public editor, how do you feel about that? As a former public editor, do you think really does that, you talked a little bit about accountability journalism in the previous question. Do you think, because obviously the public editor, the ombudsman, kind of their job was to almost hold the paper accountable for their own kind of own mistakes or whatever they were doing. Do you think not having that anymore, does that kind of create any sort of kind of environment of maybe a little, sloppiness is a little less discouraged because of the elimination of the position?
I mean, that's a great question. Definitely those jobs were set up to provide accountability, and I do think that something has been lost. The explanation that was given in both cases is that because there's so much social media now, that, Twitter and Facebook and just people being able to write in whatever, media critics all over the place are going to hold the paper accountable or hold the news organization accountable in a way that the public editor used to. And while I think there is some truth to that, there's also something that people on Twitter can't do, which is to get an answer from the main people involved. Like, you can complain on Twitter all you want to, but what you can't do is go down to the editor-in-chief's office and knock on his or her door and say, hey, here's a complaint, and I wonder if you could address this right now. You can actually get an answer. And so I do think something has been lost, and it's a little unfortunate, but in all honesty, I have to tell you that I think it's most important at places like the New York Times, which are so big and kind of like a monolith, where you feel like you can't get any answer. When I was the top editor in Buffalo, my boss, my publisher, actually came to me and said he thought maybe we should consider the idea of having an ombudsman, and I discouraged him because, well, I suppose for one thing, I didn't want someone looking over my shoulder, but also because I felt like we were a smaller news organization. I was out in the community a lot. I answered all my mail, and I think that accessibility goes a certain distance in providing the same kind of accountability. So I always like to add that because I'm not squeaky clean on this question. I don't think that every place absolutely has to have a public editor and ombudsman.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Someone else? Yes.
Hi, I'm Mara Aquarin, and I'm a junior. And I was wondering, as a child, did you see yourself being a journalist and working at the Post or the Times?
Thank you. I did. I mean, not exactly as a child, but probably around your age. I remember having a conversation. I think I was, well, you're probably a little older than 15 or 16. You might be 17. But anyway, I remember having a conversation with my older brother who was home from college, and he was asking me, what I thought I might like to do as a career. And I really had no idea. And we had been busy watching the Watergate hearings, which were a very big deal at that time in the 1970s. And journalism played a big role in Watergate, in that scandal that was happening, and the Washington Post was at the forefront of it. And my brother was very, very interested in that. So we were talking about, I like to read and I like to write and I'm interested in current events, and these were my strengths. And he actually, it was a great moment in family life, and if you can ever do this for a sibling, you should do it. But he actually pointed at me and he said, journalism. And I wasn't even totally sure what that would entail, but I took it very seriously, and that's when I got on my student newspaper. And I actually can say that I've never looked back, that I've always been interested since then. And I worked on my student newspaper. I was the editor of my high school paper, and then I, worked as a journalist all through college in different ways. And I did go to Georgetown to college, so I was in Washington then. And of course, you always admire, as a print journalist, you always admire the Washington Post and the New York Times. And that was true 30 years ago, and it's still true now. So it really has been like a dream come true to say that I've worked at both of those institutions that I admired so much when I was growing up.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes.
Hi, I'm Bobby Sweeney. I'm a sophomore here at T.C. Williams. I read a while ago from your blog post on the New York Times that you listed some pros and cons, and one of the cons was the fatal flaw of the New York Times always believing that everything they write is correct. Does the Washington Post share that?
Well, that's now you've really put me on the spot. That's a good question. I think that because the Times is such a singular institution, it's people like to refer to it as the paper of record. I don't know what that really even means anymore, but it is the largest and probably the most prominent institution of its kind, the biggest, print news organization, the biggest print newspaper in the country. And it's a place that people really try to get to as a career move. And once you get there, you sort of tend to feel like, well, I'm at the pinnacle now. And it's very hard, I think, at that point, to say, I think as human beings, we have a hard time saying I made a mistake. But I think when you're at the New York Times, it gets to be even a little bit harder. I would say that the Washington Post is a little bit less defensive about that kind of thing, and probably, in general, a little more able to say, yeah, we got it wrong and we need to correct it. But having said that, I have to say that the Times does do a really good job with their own corrections. They have a whole, they have people who are devoted only to doing corrections in the paper. So they do take the subject seriously. I think it's more sort of a psychological thing, that it's just really, really hard to say, yeah, I work for the New York, I'm good enough to be at the New York Times, but boy, I really messed up this time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Someone else? Right here.
Hi, I'm Maria Hernandez, and I'm a junior at TC. And what's your prediction about the companies, for example, like Delta Airlines and Dick's Sporting Goods, that cut ties with the NRA?
Yeah, it's been such an interesting thing to see how responsive, relatively responsive corporate America has been to the gun control issue, really as opposed to our elected officials who don't seem to be listening as much. I think that those companies have made a smart decision, one that's not only responding to something they see happening in society, but one that is probably pretty well calculated in terms of their business interests as well. So while there might be a few people who are mad at them, I think in general, we know from public opinion polls that most people in the United States would like to see more gun control. And so I think that those companies will not suffer in any severe way for taking these kinds of steps. And now, as you know, it's not just Dick's, it's a number of other big stores that sold guns, it's the airlines, it's some of the car rental companies that have cut off their partnerships with the NRA. And I think they're showing responsiveness, and I do not think that it will hurt them from a profit standpoint.
Also, what would be like your advice for those who were not directly affected by the Parkland shooting or any shooting tragedy that's been happening in the U.S. history, that would like to be or have a voice as like Emma Gonzalez or David Hawk today's.
Right. Well, I think that you guys have such a fantastic opportunity because you have all these platforms that you can use and that you've kind of grown up with, whether it's YouTube or Snapchat or whatever it may be. And I think that using those platforms to express your opinion and also to get together with those who are being active is a great way to go forward. I mean, it's so easy now, I think, to hook up with those, link up with people who are being activists and become part of it yourselves. And, while I don't think it's appropriate for me to make political statements because I'm not a politician and I'm just a humble media columnist, I do think that the gatherings that are planned, for example, the march later this month in Washington, would be one way to show solidarity.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was someone right next to you who had a question.
Hi, I'm Amna Munir. I'm a freshman, and I wanted to ask, kind of following up on her question, how do you think young teenagers are influencing journalism?
Well, I think they actually have gotten a lot of credibility over the last couple of weeks because we've seen the way that the Parkland students have challenged public officials in every way, not just face-to-face or maybe in an interview or something like that, but also on social media platforms. And I think one of the things that's been noticed so much is that because they're young and because they're students, they're not as likely to think, well, there's nothing we can do. They're more likely to think there actually is something we can do and to, keep pushing for it and not to just take answers that are evasive or avoidant, but to actually be pushing for real answers and for real action. So I think that journalists do actually have something to learn from that, which is maybe to be a little bit less cynical and to feel more idealistic, as the students seem to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Ms. Sullivan. My name's Regina Allen, and I'm a freshman. I was wondering, what is your opinion of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter as distributors of news?
Well, thank you. That's kind of the big question that we're all dealing with right now because they have so much that's good to offer and they have so much that's bad to offer. I mean, we know from the presidential campaign that Facebook in particular was used as a place to spread disinformation and misinformation, or what people like to call fake news, but I don't like to call it that for reasons I can explain if you want me to. But that's the shorthand for it. At the same time, they're phenomenal ways to get your message out. I mean, for me, it's so wonderful to be able to write something and then, almost immediately, as soon as my pieces publish, I tweet them out and I put them on Facebook. Those are really the only platforms that I use. I don't know if you feel this way, but I think you have to pick a couple and not necessarily be on every platform. I use those heavily, and I find them to be phenomenal in terms of getting feedback, getting your message out, but at the same time, they can be very, very hazardous and dangerous. And then from a business perspective, the amount of advertising that, Facebook and Google have taken away from traditional news organizations has really been very detrimental to, for example, local newspapers. So the way that local newspapers used to be able to pay their bills, their big source of money was print advertising. So that has, and then the hope was that digital advertising would make up for that. But digital advertising has very largely gone to the tech platforms and not to the traditional places. So it's kind of, I guess, to sum it up, I would say it's a blessing and a curse.
Thank you.
Yes, right here.
Hi, I'm Bridget Aduwadier, and I was wondering, since you wrote your article about the students of Stoneman Douglas High School and you mentioned how you interviewed David Hogg, I was wondering how you handle many other emotional interviews where it's hard to get information out of a source.
So thank you. Yep, and so I interviewed David Hogg by phone, and he was, this was just a couple of days, maybe 2 days after the shooting. And, as you may know, he was the student, I think, the student news director at Douglas High School. And he had actually, amazingly, been interviewing people during the shooting, he obviously was deeply affected by it. He also was trying to balance a lot of different things. I'm sure his own shock and grief and trauma with all of a sudden becoming this media celebrity, really. So, I tried to, for one thing, I tried to get what I needed from him quickly and not expect that he was going to spend 20 minutes on the phone with me, because that was not possible. And I think when you're interviewing somebody, it's good to be prepared and to know what you are trying to get and need to get, and ask good questions and quickly, try to get from the interview what you need without taking up too much of their time. Now, there could be a situation where you have 2 hours to interview somebody, but this was more like a few minutes. And so I tried to just ask the most germane and the most pointed questions I could, and then really let him go. And I also did express to him in the period of our phone conversation that I was very sorry for what he'd been through. And I think it's always important to treat people as fellow human beings and not to just treat them as interview subjects.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Leah Nicholsberg. I'm a sophomore. And you said you don't like to use the term fake news. Why is that?
Well, thank you. The term fake news, when it actually hasn't been around that long. I mean, the broader subject of fake news, there's been misinformation and lies, of course, for a long time. But the term fake news hasn't been around that long. It kind of cropped up during the presidential campaign. And then very quickly, it was sort of, the meaning of it was changed because President Trump began to call the legitimate press, what I would call the reality-based press, he began to call them the fake news media. So while fake news in its, I guess, real form or its pure form means lies spread, perhaps on Facebook or elsewhere, false information in the form of news stories. For example, during the campaign, the idea that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump, or that Hillary Clinton was on some sort of narcotics or, psychotropic drugs or something like that. These were put out there to fool people. But then when the president started using fake news to say, in essence, to say, I don't like that, then I think the meaning of it got changed, and the word I used to describe it is weaponized. It's like the words were turned into a weapon against legitimate journalism or the legitimate news media. So I think it's been so confused now in people's minds that I prefer to say, for example, that's a lie, that's a conspiracy theory, that's a false news story, that's disinformation, or whatever it may be. Although it's kind of an uphill battle because the phrase does mean something to people, and I understand that, and it is a shorthand way to talk about it. But also, by saying I don't use it anymore, it's a chance to explain why I don't, and to draw attention to the fact that it's been kind of tainted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Jada Hairston. I'm a sophomore at TC. And the question I would like to ask you is, do you prefer reporting or editing, and why?
Thank you. That's a question close to my heart. Well, at this point of my life, and I've been in journalism for decades now, I prefer to write. But for a long time, so I started out as a reporter. And then I had this ambition to become, a leader in my news organization and to be able to be, to kind of get my vision out there and change things as I wanted to change them, and to mentor young people and to help make the newspaper better. And I thought the best way I could do that was by being the boss. And I really enjoyed it, and I did it for a long time. I mean, I was the top editor for nearly 13 years. But right now, I feel like I don't have a desire to do that because I did it, and I can't. So Buffalo was my hometown. So I can't think of anything more important as an editor than to be the editor of your hometown paper. But I kind of outgrew it. I was ready to do something else. So now I think that writing and being on the creative side of things, and also I've been doing some teaching, and I hope to get back to that, teaching journalism. I think that's the best way for me right now to be useful to journalism and to journalists and to society. So also I'm very tired of going to meetings, and that's what you pretty much do a lot and the headaches are terrible. I mean, there's always a lawsuit or some terrible personnel problem or you have to lay people off or someone's plagiarizing. I mean, there are a million extremely worrisome problems. And so having done it, I'm glad now that I'm really responsible only for myself.
Thank you.
Yes.
Following up on a few questions
Sure.
back, how has journalism changed through your career, and if so, has it changed positively or just kind of neutral?
Or negatively.
Or negative?
Well, it's changed a lot. So, I mean, when I started out reporting, I mean, it was a long time ago, and we were typing on typewriters, and we were threading carbon paper into typewriters, and there was no digital anything. That changed pretty quickly after I had started, but the digital transformation of media is by far the biggest thing that's happened, and it's created both good and bad changes. So for local newspapers and for a lot of news organizations, the bad part has been that the business model has been so hurt that we've had to lay people off and we don't have the staff that we used to have. But the good side is that the ability to distribute your work and to talk to people all over the world and to have this broad impact has never been greater. So it's both really positive and really negative. I mean, in general, I tend to believe in progress and I wouldn't go back, but I do see the downside of it too. And that's definitely the technological changes, and everything that's brought with it has been by far the biggest change.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So who else hasn't? Yeah, you haven't asked.
Hi, I am Jamal Omar, and I am a freshman. I just want to follow up on that last question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think journalism will change in the future?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that because I could write 3 columns about it and then retire. But I don't know for sure, but I think that we're going to have to get better at certain things. For one thing, we're going to have to get better at finding out how to support ourselves financially. We're also going to have to get a lot better with helping people understand what's real and what's false. because there is so much false information out there. And I think we need to get better at, helping people be good citizens and sort of finding their way through this sort of crush of information that sometimes feels like a fire hose of information, spouting out at you at all times. So I think we need to help people make sense of that a little bit more. And also, we know just from the past 10 or 15 years, there's been so much technological change that it's really impossible to predict. I mean, artificial intelligence is going to come along and change journalism, and probably some things that we don't even know about yet, or maybe some people who are working in Silicon Valley know about, but we don't yet, are probably going to turn journalism on its head more times than we can count. So I think we have to be flexible and adjustable, but also keep close to the one thing that we know is really important, which is being fair and informing people so they can make good decisions about their government.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Riley Buckholtz. I'm a freshman. And I was wondering if the reactions that you get on your pieces affect the way you write.
Thanks, Riley. Well, they do, although it's very strange, actually. I get a lot of reaction, depending on what I write, but there have been pieces where I've probably gotten, just on the comments right on the piece on the Washington Post site, there have been a couple pieces I've written that have gotten like 4,000 comments. And then, of course, on Twitter, on Facebook, and then the ones that probably I take the most personally are the ones in my email, because there's a little email icon on each one of my stories, and so people feel free to write to me. And what often happens is I'll get very extreme reactions. So I'll get people saying, oh, thank you so much, and, we really, my husband and I always read you, and keep doing what you're doing, it's so important. And then the next email that I'll open up about the same piece will, call me some terrible name that I can't repeat here at a high school, and say that, I should be ashamed of myself. And so, I can't say that I've changed. I still try to stay true to what I'm trying to do and to do the kind of journalism that I've always felt I should, but I'm still affected. I think I'm especially affected by people who are so negative. It is very discouraging. And that has become more prevalent because I think our president is so critical of the news media. It seems to encourage other people. And I don't mind being challenged or having people say, you got this wrong, or would you consider this? But I don't like being insulted. And I think that's, if we could have a little more civility, it would be nice. Of course, I think if people think I'm being unfair about something or biased, I certainly pay attention to that. But, so yeah, I say I'm definitely responsive to it, but I couldn't tell you like one way that I've really changed things. It's more that I do pay attention to it, and I try to be as kind of open as I can be. And some days I'm not really up for it because it's so pervasive, and so there's just so much of it. But that's actually also the good thing, because, again, in the old days, you might get a couple of letters in the mail, or somebody would write a letter to the editor. Now, in the digital world, we have the whole, and because the Washington Post has a global readership, you can hear from people all over the world, and people have ways of contacting you really directly. And again, it's kind of this double-edged sword. It's both negative and positive.
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Somebody who hasn't had a question yet?
Hi, I'm Madeline Harvey. How has your work personally affected you?
Well, it's kind of hard to separate my my life from my work, because I've grown up doing this. So it's a little bit like saying, how has my life affected me? It's so ingrained in my life. But I would say that it's encouraged me to keep an open mind about things, because I know that there are different opinions about things. It's encouraged me to be a big reader, and to try to read as widely as possible. And I think, the great thing about journalism, and probably the thing I appreciate the most about it, is that you can be, and you have to be, kind of a lifelong learner. You have to keep learning and keep your mind open, or else your work is going to really suffer. So I guess those are some of the ways.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Caroline Miles. I'm a freshman, and I was wondering what stories in the next few months will be the most important or relevant to what is happening now.
Well, I mean, you're not just talking about on my area, which is media, but in general, right? Well, certainly I think that, of course, now that I work at the Washington Post, where national politics is such an obsession, I feel like that's what I think of first. So I think what happens in the midterm congressional elections is going to be a huge, huge story. Are either of the houses of Congress are they both going to stay Republican dominated, or are they going to flip over? Is one of them going to flip over? So I think that that's a huge story. I think the Me Too movement and the whole thing about sexual harassment in the workplace is going to continue to be a huge story. And I think that gun control is going to be a dominant story as well. It's been really interesting to see how both the Me Too movement and the gun control story after the terrible shooting in Florida have continued. They have stayed in the news. They haven't really faded away. So that makes me think that they have real enduring value, and I think that they'll keep going. I mean, on an international level, the relationship, if you can call it that, with North Korea is certainly an important, huge story, and certainly a very dangerous story. And, our relationship with the countries in the Middle East, I think, is a big deal also.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Has anybody not asked a question? Okay, so we can, yeah.
I think you've alluded to this a little bit in previous questions, but I really want to kind of hone in on it. With the onset of digital media, with both really just social media being able to spread news, but also online magazines like The Verge and Slate and all those other publications. And really, as considering you worked at the Buffalo News and you were the editor, so you certainly have a background at a local paper, how do you think really the onset of the digital age is really affected kind of not only local papers but also larger papers, considering like what happened with the Miami Sentinel or Tribune and like Tronc and all that? Really, what do you think? What do you think about that?
Well, there was a time when local newspapers really used to be owned by local families and or local owners, and that is no longer the case. Now it's really likely that they would be owned by a chain ownership or by a big corporation of some kind. And in general, I would say that is a bad thing. That it is very helpful to have someone in the community who cares about journalism and who is willing to invest in it. And when your newspaper company is owned by a hedge fund who's only trying to sort of take the profit out of it and doesn't care if you have to do that by laying off 3/4 of the news staff, then I think that's been a very bad development. And that has happened in the digital age. I don't know if it can be tied exactly to technology, but I mean, just as one example, there's a paper in California called the San Jose Mercury News, and for years it was like one of these papers that you would really admire. It had a great staff. They won Pulitzer Prizes. They had 400 people in their newsroom, which is a very big newsroom. And I read recently, and they're owned by a big chain ownership, which is, has been very tough on all the newspapers. it's owned for profit reasons. They're down to 39 people from 400 in their newsroom, and there's no way they could possibly be covering their community effectively. Like, I can't imagine they're even able to like go to the school board meetings or the city hall meetings. So that's been really, really discouraging, and it's a very bad development, and I don't know what the answer is. I think your standing makes me think we should wrap this up.
Do we have time for one or two more?
Thank you.
We've got some interest here.
Sure, right here.
You discussed earlier why you don't like to use the word fake news,
Yes.
because it's turned more into a weapon.
Yes.
I was wondering whether or not you think the word will endure, like its weaponized form will endure long after the Trump presidency, and how it will impact journalism.
Well, I don't think the term is going away anytime soon. And I think that in both of the ways that it can be meant, it probably will endure. I don't think that, lies that are spread via the internet, I don't think that's going away. So that kind of fake news, unfortunately, is probably here to stay and probably going to get worse. And then the question of whether the disparagement of the news media is going to hang around. I mean, I think that it is. We know from public opinion polls that people have low trust in the news media, and that's unfortunate. So I think both of the ways that it can be used and described are probably here to stay, and both of them are bad.
Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe, yeah, we'll do, how about just this one more and wrap it up?
Hi, I'm Madeline Kwem, a freshman at TC. What advice will you give to young female journalists?
Well, this is advice I would give to young journalists in general, so male or female. I would say the most important thing you can do is to read, pick a news organization that you trust, or a couple of them, and really, really read them every day and really keep up with the news. I mean, even though it might seem old-fashioned, it's actually great to read a print newspaper every day if you can, because you actually get a beginning, middle, and an end, and you can get a good update on what's happening. So I'd say to read widely, and to practice the craft of journalism however you can, whether it's on a school newspaper or eventually on an internship, to actually get out there and do it. Like, it's sort of the advice that people give anyone who wants to write. If you want to write, you must write, and if you want to do journalism, you have to start doing it in whatever form is available to you, and try to just get better at it, and find some role models that you admire and look up to, and try to see what they're doing and try to keep track of them and emulate them. But probably the biggest thing is to really, really stay informed about the news in as widespread a way as you can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Your questions were awesome.
All right. Well, Ms. Sullivan, we're so grateful to you for taking the time to do this. We want to say thank you to our friends from the television production classes.
Absolutely.
Ms. Zephron and her group, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. We couldn't do it without you. And we hope that when you have coffee, maybe that you could have coffee in your official Theogony mug.
Oh, thank you very much.
So,
that's nice.
So it was great having you. It was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you
you
very
so
much.
much. And thank you from T.C. Williams.
It was nice to meet you all.
Okay.
Your questions were really terrific.
Okay.